A battalion cook with no military training discovered that 500 soldiers could survive 3 extra weeks on rations meant to last only 14 days. His method violated every regulation in the Army Field Manual. But by the time officers discovered what he had done, 200 men were already alive who should have starved to death. At 11:15 a.m. on February 9th, 1943, Corporal Frank Kozlowski stood in a supply tent on Attu Island in the Aleutian Chain, staring at a problem that would kill his entire battalion within 18 days. The thermometer outside read -22 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind gusts reached 60 miles per hour. Supply ships could not reach the island. Enemy forces controlled the surrounding waters, and Kozlowski had just counted every can, every box, every ounce of food remaining in the battalion's stores. The numbers were impossible. 512 men. 14 days of rations remaining. But the next supply delivery was scheduled for 35 days from now. Maybe longer if weather delayed the convoy. Division Command had radioed that morning, "Hold position, no evacuation possible. Make your supplies last." Kozlowski did the mathematics in his head. 500 men eating for 35 days would require 2.5 times the food currently in storage. Even with severe rationing, the battalion would be eating nothing but melted snow by day 16. By day 25, men would be too weak to maintain defensive positions. By day 30, soldiers would start dying from starvation and exposure combined. But Kozlowski had worked in restaurant kitchens in Chicago before the war. He had stretched food budgets through the Depression. He had fed hungry families on scraps other cooks would throw away. And as he stood in that freezing supply tent, looking at crates of canned meat and boxes of hardtack, he realized something every other soldier had missed. The United States Army was wasting half the calories in every ration they issued. What Kozlowski did next was completely illegal. It violated food safety regulations, broke standard operating procedures, and contradicted direct orders from Division Command about ration distribution. But it worked. And when Army inspectors finally investigated 3 months later, they found something that would change Arctic warfare doctrine forever. The question was simple. How did 500 men survive for 37 days on food meant to last 14? Corporal Frank Michael Kozlowski was 28 years old, originally from the south side of Chicago, where he had worked as a line cook at a Polish restaurant on Archer Avenue before Pearl Harbor. He had enlisted in January 1942, completed basic training at Fort Ord, and been assigned to the 184th Infantry Regiment as a battalion cook. Kozlowski had been in the Aleutians for 7 months, preparing meals in conditions that froze soup solid within minutes of serving. He held the rank of corporal only because the previous head cook had been evacuated with frostbite in November. Kozlowski had no formal training in military food service. Everything he knew about feeding large groups came from 10 years working in civilian kitchens during the Depression, when restaurant owners demanded maximum output from minimum ingredients. His mother had taught him to waste nothing. His first boss had taught him that hungry people do not care about presentation. They care about calories and warmth. Kozlowski was short, 5 feet 6 inches tall, with thick forearms from years of lifting cast-iron cookware. He had dark hair that was always slightly too long because he kept missing formation for haircuts. Other soldiers found him quiet, methodical, occasionally stubborn. He rarely spoke unless he had something specific to say. But kitchen staff noticed that Kozlowski never forgot an inventory count, never miscalculated a recipe conversion, and never served a meal late even when generators failed and stoves went cold. He had been on Attu Island since July 19, 1942. The island was a desolate rock in the western Aleutian chain, closer to Japan than to mainland Alaska. American forces had established a garrison there to block Japanese expansion toward the continental United States. The environment was brutally hostile. Temperatures rarely climbed above freezing, even in summer. Windstorms arrived without warning. Fog obscured visibility for days at a time. Supply lines stretched across 1,000 miles of North Pacific waters, where Japanese submarines hunted American convoys. Kozlowski had served approximately 2,000 meals since arriving on Attu. He had watched rations arrive irregular and insufficient. He had stretched food supplies during 3 previous shortages by reducing portion sizes and eliminating breakfast on alternating days. He had submitted 11 formal requests for additional supplies to Division Command. 6 had been ignored. 5 had been denied due to shipping limitations. But this shortage was different. This was not about smaller portions or skipped meals. This was about fundamental survival. And Kozlowski knew that standard rationing procedures would not save the battalion. He needed to fundamentally change how the Army was feeding soldiers in Arctic conditions. The solution came from his civilian experience, but implementing it would require breaking rules that had been written to keep soldiers safe. The United States Army had been losing soldiers to malnutrition in the Attu Islands since June 1942. Not from starvation itself, but from the combination of insufficient calories and extreme cold that weakened immune systems, reduced physical capability, and made men vulnerable to pneumonia, frostbite, and exhaustion. Division medical officers had documented 23 deaths attributable to cold-related illness in soldiers who were simultaneously malnourished. Another 47 soldiers had been evacuated with severe frostbite or hypothermia after their bodies lacked sufficient energy to maintain core temperature. Kozlowski had watched this happen to men he fed every day. Private Eddie Kowalski, no relation, from Milwaukee, had died on January 14th. Eddie had been 20 years old, a radio operator who worked 18-hour shifts monitoring Japanese communications. He had been losing weight for weeks. Kozlowski had noticed Eddie's uniform hanging loose, noticed him shivering, even inside heated tents. On January 13th, Eddie had collapsed during his shift. Medics found his core body temperature at 92 degrees. He died the next morning from hypothermia and pneumonia. The medical report listed exposure as cause of death, but Kozlowski knew Eddie had not been eating enough to keep warm. Corporal James Martinez from El Paso had been evacuated on January 23rd with third-degree frostbite on both feet. Martinez had been on guard duty in minus 15-degree weather. Standard procedure was 2-hour shifts with warm-up breaks. Martinez had completed his shift, but by the time he reached the warming tent, his boots had frozen to his feet. Medics amputated 6 toes. Martinez was shipped stateside. He would never walk normally again. The official report blamed inadequate cold weather gear, but Kozlowski had served Martinez his meals. He knew Martinez had been eating less than 2,000 calories daily for 3 weeks. A properly nourished soldier could have maintained circulation in those temperatures. Sergeant William Chen from San Francisco had lost 30 pounds between November and January. Chen was a supply sergeant, one of the few men who understood exactly how short the battalion was on food. Chen had been rationing his own meals voluntarily, trying to stretch supplies for younger soldiers. Kozlowski had noticed but said nothing because Chen outranked him. On February 2nd, Chen had fainted while inventorying ammunition. Medics diagnosed severe malnutrition and dehydration. Chen was still recovering in the battalion aid station, too weak to return to duty. These were not isolated incidents. Between November 1942 and February 1943, the 184th Infantry Regiment had lost operational strength equivalent to one full company, approximately 120 men, due to cold weather injuries and illness. Almost all those casualties had occurred among soldiers who were simultaneously undernourished. The problem was systemic and mathematical. Standard Army field rations in 1943 provided approximately 3,000 calories per soldier per day under normal conditions. This was calculated for soldiers in temperate climates performing moderate physical activity. But Attu Island was not temperate. Soldiers burned an estimated 4,000 to 5,000 calories daily, just maintaining body temperature in sub-zero conditions. Walking patrol in Arctic wind burned an additional 1,000 calories. Manual labor, digging entrenchments in frozen ground, burned even more. The Army ration calculation assumed soldiers needed 3,000 calories. Aleutian soldiers actually needed 5,000. The shortfall was 2,000 calories per day per man. Over weeks, this deficit accumulated into dangerous weight loss, weakened immune response, and reduced cold tolerance. Division Command understood this problem theoretically. They had requested increased ration allocations for Aleutian garrisons in August 1942. The request had been denied by Continental Supply Command because shipping capacity was prioritized for combat zones in the Pacific and Europe. The Aleutians were considered a quiet front. Soldiers there were supposed to make do with standard rations. Making do meant soldiers were starving slowly while defending American territory. Kozlowski had submitted his first formal complaint about ration inadequacy in September. He had documented weight loss among kitchen staff, had calculated the caloric deficit, had requested double rations for all personnel. His company commander had forwarded the request to battalion. Battalion had forwarded it to regiment. Regiment had forwarded it to division. Division had responded 6 weeks later. Request denied. Maintain standard ration distribution. Supplemental calories not available. Kozlowski had submitted another request in October. Denied. Another in November. Denied. December. Denied. By January, Kozlowski had stopped submitting formal requests. He had started taking unauthorized action instead. He increased portion sizes by 15%, compensating by reducing the frequency of hot meals. He eliminated breakfast twice weekly, serving only coffee and hardtack, then provided larger lunch and dinner portions. He requisitioned extra cooking fuel and kept soup kettles simmering continuously so soldiers could eat between scheduled meals. These modifications helped marginally. Soldiers were still losing weight, but more slowly. Then the supply situation collapsed entirely. On February 8th, Division Command radioed that the next supply convoy was delayed indefinitely due to Japanese submarine activity near Attu Island. Ships could not risk the passage until naval escorts arrived from Pearl Harbor. Estimated delay? 3 weeks minimum, possibly 5 weeks, depending on weather and enemy activity. Current supplies on Attu would need to last until mid-March at earliest. Kozlowski had inventoried supplies immediately. The count was devastating. 7,200 pounds of canned meat, mostly Spam and corned beef. 4,000 pounds of hardtack biscuits. 2,000 pounds of dried beans. 1,000 pounds of powdered eggs. 800 pounds of coffee. 600 pounds of sugar. 300 pounds of powdered milk. Miscellaneous canned vegetables, jams, and condiments totaling approximately 1,000 pounds. Total? roughly 19,000 pounds of food. 512 soldiers eating for 35 days would require at least 55,000 pounds of food at current ration levels. Even with severe rationing, cutting portions by half, the battalion needed 27,000 pounds minimum. They had 19,000 pounds, and that assumes zero waste, perfect utilization, nothing spoiled or lost. Kozlowski had done the mathematics 3 times, hoping he had made an error. The numbers did not change. At standard consumption rates, the battalion would run out of food by February 22nd. At survival rationing, maybe February 27th. Either way, soldiers would be starving by early March, 2 weeks before the supply convoy could possibly arrive. The battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Richard Hayes, had called an officers' meeting that evening. Kozlowski had not attended because he was enlisted, but he heard the outcome from the company supply sergeant. Division command had authorized emergency rationing, 2 meals daily, reduced portions, priority to soldiers on active patrol duty. Medical staff would monitor for signs of acute malnutrition. Soldiers too weak for duty would be confined to quarters to reduce calorie expenditure. The battalion would maintain defensive positions but suspend all non-essential operations. Hayes had asked if any alternatives existed. The supply sergeant had said no. The food they had was the food they had. Nothing more could arrive until ships could reach the island. The battalion would eat less and hope the convoy arrived on schedule. Kozlowski had heard this and said nothing to the supply sergeant, but he had walked back to the mess tent, looked at the inventory again, and realized that everyone was asking the wrong question. The question was not how to ration existing food. The question was how to extract more calories from the same food. And Kozlowski knew the answer to that question. He had learned it during the Depression, when Chicago restaurant owners demanded he stretch ground beef into meals for twice as many customers. He had learned it from his mother, who had fed 6 children through winters when her husband was unemployed. The United States Army was throwing away food, not intentionally, not obviously, but systematically, through cooking methods that destroyed nutrition, through serving protocols that wasted edible material, through storage procedures that allowed spoilage. Kozlowski could fix that. But fixing it meant breaking regulations that existed for legitimate safety reasons. Regulations written to prevent food poisoning, to maintain sanitation standards, to protect soldiers from contaminated meals. Kozlowski stood in the supply tent at midnight, staring at crates of canned meat, and made his decision. He would break the rules. He would risk court-martial, because following regulations was going to kill 200 men. Kozlowski sat on his bunk at 11:30 p.m. on February 9th, wrapped in 2 wool blankets, thinking about restaurant kitchens in Chicago. His bunk was in a corner of the kitchen staff tent, separated from the other cooks by a canvas partition. The tent was cold despite 2 kerosene heaters running continuously. Wind rattled the canvas walls. Snow had drifted against the exterior and provided some insulation, but temperature inside still hovered around 40 degrees. Kozlowski could see his breath. He was holding a can of Spam, turning it over in his hands, examining it like he had examined thousands of cans over the past 7 months. Standard Army issue, 12 ounces of processed pork and ham in a rectangular metal container. The label listed ingredients: pork shoulder, ham, salt, water, sugar, sodium nitrite. Nutrition information on the side. Approximately 1,000 calories per can, primarily from fat and protein. Kozlowski had served Spam in dozens of variations. Fried Spam with powdered eggs for breakfast. Spam and beans for lunch. Spam hash with potatoes for dinner. Spam sandwiches on hardtack. Spam mixed into soup. Soldiers complained about the monotony, but Spam was reliable, shelf-stable, and calorie-dense. It was the foundation of every meal Kozlowski prepared. But Spam was also wasteful. The revelation had come earlier that evening while Kozlowski was preparing dinner. He had opened 40 cans of Spam to feed 250 soldiers. Each can contained not just meat, but also a layer of congealed fat and gelatin that formed during the canning process. Standard procedure was to drain this residue into waste buckets. The meat was served, the fat and gelatin were discarded. Kozlowski had watched himself pour approximately 3 quarts of fat and gelatin into the waste bucket, and suddenly realized what he was throwing away. Fat was calories. Pure, concentrated calories. 1 gram of fat contained 9 calories, more than twice the caloric density of protein or carbohydrates. That congealed fat in the bottom of each Spam can represented approximately 200 calories per can. 40 cans meant 8,000 calories thrown away in a single meal. 2 meals daily meant 16,000 calories discarded every day. Over 14 days, the battalion was throwing away 224,000 calories, equivalent to the complete caloric needs of 45 soldiers for one day. They were literally throwing away enough calories to keep 45 men alive for 24 hours. And Spam was not the only waste. Canned corned beef had similar fat content. Beans cooked in standard boiling water leached nutrients into the cooking liquid, which was then discarded. Hardtack biscuits produced crumbs during handling and serving. Coffee grounds were thrown away after single use. Vegetable cans contained liquid that soldiers did not drink. Every meal the Army served involved systematic waste of edible calories. Kozlowski sat on his bunk, still holding the Spam can, and calculated how much food the battalion was actually throwing away. He estimated conservatively 10% of total caloric content lost to standard preparation and serving methods. 10% of 19,000 pounds was 1,900 pounds. 1,900 pounds of food that could keep soldiers alive, but was currently being treated as waste. That was 4 days of additional rations, maybe 5 days if carefully managed. But Kozlowski realized he could do better than 10% recovery. He thought about techniques from the restaurant. During the Depression, his boss at the Polish restaurant had implemented a zero-waste policy. Everything edible went into something. Meat drippings became gravy. Vegetable scraps became soup stock. Stale bread became breadcrumbs or croutons. Bones were boiled for marrow. Fat was rendered and reused. Nothing that contained calories ever touched the garbage. The restaurant had increased effective food supply by approximately 30% without buying more ingredients. They had simply stopped throwing away nutrition. Kozlowski could do the same thing here. He could recover the fat from canned meat and use it as cooking oil. He could save bean cooking water and use it as soup base. He could collect hardtack crumbs and mix them into other dishes. He could reuse coffee grounds for second and third brewing. He could serve the liquid from canned vegetables as broth. None of this was technically difficult. It just required changing procedures. But every change violated Army regulations. Field Manual 21-10, Army Food Service, specified exact preparation protocols for every ration item. Fat rendered from canned meat was considered contaminated and unsanitary. Water used to cook dried beans was classified as waste. Hardtack crumbs were food debris. Coffee grounds were to be used once and discarded. Vegetable liquid was not approved for consumption. These regulations existed for good reasons. During World War I, thousands of soldiers had died from food poisoning caused by contaminated field kitchens. The Army had responded by implementing strict sanitation standards and preparation protocols. Every cook was trained to follow these protocols exactly. Deviation meant risking disease outbreaks that could disable entire units. Kozlowski understood this. He had read the field manual. He had attended food service training. He knew why the regulations existed. But he also knew that regulations written for temperate climates and adequate supply did not account for Arctic conditions and starvation rations. Soldiers were not going to die from eating fat recovered from Spam cans. The fat was already cooked, already preserved, already safe. Throwing it away made sense when food was abundant, but when soldiers were starving, throwing away calories was criminal. Kozlowski made his decision sitting on that bunk, holding that can of Spam at approximately midnight on February 9th. He would implement a zero-waste system. He would recover every edible calorie from every ration item. He would violate field manual protocols systematically and deliberately. And he would not ask permission because permission would be denied. The modification would require changing how the kitchen operated. He would need cooperation from his cooking staff. He would need to train them on new procedures. He would need to hide what he was doing from battalion officers who might order him to stop. Most critically, he would need to solve the storage problem. Recovering waste calories was only useful if those calories could be preserved and distributed over time. Fat, rendered from canned meat, would spoil within days at room temperature. Bean cooking water would ferment. Coffee grounds would mold. Everything Kozlowski planned to save would degrade quickly unless stored properly. But Kozlowski had an advantage that cooks in temperate climates did not have. He had sub-zero temperatures outside his tent 24 hours a day. He had natural refrigeration that would keep rendered fat frozen solid for months. He had an entire Arctic island functioning as a freezer. He could store recovered food outside, buried in snow, frozen in containers. He could create a secondary food supply that existed nowhere in official records. When the primary rations ran out, he could start serving from the hidden stockpile. Officers would assume the battalion was starving, but soldiers would still be eating. It was completely illegal. It would work perfectly. Kozlowski stood up, pulled on his parka, and walked outside into the February night. Wind hit him immediately, dropping the effective temperature to minus 40 degrees. He walked 50 yards from the tent, found a spot where snow had drifted deep against a supply bunker, and started digging. He would bury his first cache here. Nobody would think to look for food supplies in an unmarked snowdrift. Nobody would discover what he was doing until it was too late to stop him. Kozlowski dug for 30 minutes, creating a pit 3 feet deep and 4 feet across. He packed the sides firm, lining the pit with empty wooden crates to prevent collapse. Then he covered the pit with canvas and marked the location by counting steps from the supply bunker corner. 15 paces north, 8 paces west. That was cache number 1. He would create 10 more caches over the next week, scattered around the camp perimeter, hidden in snowdrifts, invisible to anyone who did not know they existed. Kozlowski returned to the tent, brushed snow from his parka, and began planning the morning's work. He would start tomorrow with breakfast preparation. Instead of draining fat from Spam, he would collect it. Instead of discarding bean water, he would save it. Instead of throwing away coffee grounds, he would dry them for reuse. He would break the rules one meal at a time. And he would feed 500 men through a winter that should have killed them all. Kozlowski began implementing his system at 0430 hours on February 10th, 1943. He had woken before his kitchen staff to prepare breakfast alone. Standard morning meal was fried Spam with powdered eggs and coffee. Kozlowski prepared it exactly as usual except for one critical modification. He had placed an empty 5-gallon steel pot on the floor beside his work table. As he opened each Spam can, he tilted it over the pot and let the congealed fat slide out. Normally, this fat went into the waste bucket. Now it went into collection. Kozlowski opened 60 cans of Spam for breakfast. Each can released approximately 3 ounces of fat. 60 cans produced 180 ounces, approximately 1.5 gallons of pure rendered fat. It pooled in the bottom of the steel pot, gray and translucent, still solid from cold storage but beginning to liquefy in the tense relative warmth. Private Danny Sullivan, Kozlowski's assistant cook, arrived at 0500 hours and immediately noticed the pot of fat. "Why are we saving that?" Sullivan asked. He was 19 years old, from Boston, had been working in the kitchen for 4 months. Kozlowski looked at Sullivan for a moment, evaluating whether to trust him. Then he explained, "We are throwing away calories we need. That fat is food. We are going to save it and use it." Sullivan frowned. "The manual says to discard rendered fat. It's contaminated." "The manual assumes we have enough food," Kozlowski said. "We do not have enough food. That fat will keep men alive. We are keeping it." Sullivan was quiet. Then he asked the question Kozlowski knew was coming. "Is this legal?" "No," Kozlowski said. "It violates Section 4, Paragraph 12 of the Field Manual. If anyone reports this, I will be court-martialed. But nobody is going to report it, because you are not going to tell anyone. You understand?" Sullivan nodded slowly. "What do you need me to do?" Kozlowski pointed to the pot of fat. "After breakfast, we take that outside. We bury it in snow in a marked location. Then we do the same thing at lunch. And dinner. Every meal. We collect, we store, we keep records of where everything is buried." Over the next 3 hours, Kozlowski and Sullivan served breakfast to 512 soldiers. Fried Spam, powdered eggs scrambled with water, hardtack biscuits, coffee. Standard issue. Nobody noticed any difference. But after the meal, Kozlowski had collected not just the rendered fat, but also the cooking oil used for frying. Standard procedure was to discard used oil after one use. Kozlowski saved it. He poured it into mason jars, salvaged from previous supply shipments, sealed them, carried them outside, and buried them in cache site number 1. The fat from the Spam cans went into a separate container, also buried. By the end of breakfast, Kozlowski had hidden approximately 2 gallons of edible fat, representing roughly 20,000 calories. At lunch, Kozlowski prepared beans with Spam. Standard procedure for dried beans required soaking them overnight, then boiling in clean water until soft. The cooking water turned brown, filled with starches and proteins leached from the beans. Standard procedure was to drain this water and serve only the beans themselves. Kozlowski kept the water. He poured it into canteens, sealed them, buried them in cache site number 2. The water contained approximately 5,000 calories in dissolved nutrients. It tasted terrible, but was perfectly safe and nutritionally valuable. He also collected grease from frying Spam chunks. Another gallon, another 20,000 calories buried in cache site 3. Dinner was corned beef hash with canned vegetables. Kozlowski followed the same protocol. He collected fat from the corned beef, collected liquid from the vegetable cans, collected cooking oil used for frying. Everything went into containers. Everything went into snow caches. By the end of February 10th, Kozlowski had recovered and hidden approximately 60,000 calories. That was enough food energy to sustain 12 soldiers for 1 full day at minimum survival rations. From 1 day of cooking, he had created 1 day of additional food supply. If he maintained this rate for 14 days, he could extend the battalion's rations by 2 weeks. But Kozlowski knew he could do better. He had only started with the most obvious sources. There were other opportunities. Coffee grounds were the next target. The battalion consumed approximately 100 pounds of coffee per week. Standard procedure was to brew coffee once, then discard the grounds. But coffee grounds retained significant caffeine and flavor after first brewing. Kozlowski knew from restaurant experience that grounds could be dried and reused for second and third brewing. The coffee would be weaker, but still functional. In Arctic conditions, hot caffeinated liquid was essential for maintaining morale and alertness. Kozlowski began collecting used coffee grounds after breakfast on February 11th. He spread them on baking sheets, placed the sheets near the kerosene heaters to dry. By evening, the grounds were dry enough to store. He packed them into cloth bags, labeled them second brew and third brew, and stored them with the regular coffee supplies. Nobody noticed because coffee stores were Sullivan's responsibility, and Sullivan was helping Kozlowski hide everything. Hardtack biscuits produced enormous amounts of crumbs during handling and serving. Boxes of hardtack were rough-handled by soldiers who grabbed handfuls. Biscuits broke. Crumbs accumulated at the bottom of boxes and on serving tables. Standard procedure was to brush these crumbs into waste buckets. Kozlowski collected the crumbs. He swept them into containers, stored them separately, and planned to mix them into soup or hash. Hardtack crumbs were essentially flour, and flour could extend any dish. Over 3 days, Kozlowski collected approximately 40 pounds of hardtack crumbs, representing roughly 40,000 calories. Canned vegetable liquid was another source. Cans of peas, carrots, and green beans contained liquid preservative that was technically edible, but unappetizing. Soldiers did not drink it. Standard procedure was to drain it away. Kozlowski collected it, combined it with bean cooking water, and created a thin soup base that could be heated and served to soldiers who wanted additional liquid. He buried 20 gallons of this liquid in Cache Site 4 by February 13th. The system expanded systematically. Kozlowski trained his entire kitchen staff on collection procedures. Every cook knew to save rendered fat, used oil, bean water, coffee grounds, hardtack crumbs, and vegetable liquid. Nothing edible was discarded. Everything went into labeled containers. Everything went into hidden snow caches. By February 15th, Kozlowski had created 11 cache sites scattered around the camp perimeter. Each site was marked by dead reckoning from fixed landmarks. Cache 1 was 15 paces north and 8 paces west from the supply bunker corner. Cache 2 was 20 paces east from the mess tent rear entrance. Cache 3 was under the abandoned Jeep near the motor pool. Each location was memorized by Kozlowski and recorded in a small notebook he kept hidden inside his bunk mattress. The notebook contained detailed inventory of every cache. Site 1, 40 gallons rendered fat, estimated 200,000 calories. Site 2, 30 gallons bean water and vegetable liquid, estimated 50,000 calories. Site 3, 60 pounds reusable coffee grounds. Site 4, 80 pounds hardtack crumbs, estimated 80,000 calories. Total recovered calories by February 15th. Approximately 1,200,000 calories. That represented enough food energy to sustain the entire battalion for 2 additional days at survival rations. And Kozlowski was only 6 days into the collection system. But hiding the cache sites was becoming more difficult. Soldiers noticed Kozlowski and Sullivan carrying containers outside after meals. A few asked questions. Kozlowski told them he was storing backup water supplies in case the wells froze. Nobody questioned this explanation, because frozen wells were a constant concern. But Kozlowski knew the lie would not hold indefinitely. Eventually, an officer would investigate. Eventually, someone would discover the hidden food caches. Kozlowski needed the discovery to happen at the right time. Too early, and officers would order him to stop before he had accumulated enough supplies. Too late, and the emergency food would not save anyone. The right time was when official rations ran out, when the battalions started starving, when officers were desperate for solutions. Then Kozlowski could reveal the cache system and prove it worked. By that point, soldiers would already be eating from hidden supplies without knowing it. Kozlowski could demonstrate that recovered calories were safe and sufficient. Officers would have to accept the system because the alternative was starvation. But maintaining secrecy until then required absolute discipline from kitchen staff. 7 people now knew about the caches: Kozlowski, Sullivan, and 5 other cooks. Kozlowski had threatened all of them with collective punishment if anyone talked. He told them that if officers discovered the system early, everyone involved would face court-martial for violating sanitation regulations. The entire kitchen staff would be relieved and possibly imprisoned. This threat worked because it was true. What Kozlowski was doing was systematically illegal. He was violating food safety standards written to protect soldiers from disease. If even one soldier got sick from eating recovered fat or bean water or reused coffee grounds, Kozlowski would be personally responsible. The Army would blame him for poisoning troops. He would face criminal charges. Kozlowski accepted this risk. He had concluded that starvation was a greater danger than food poisoning. Soldiers were not going to die from eating rendered spam fat that had been frozen solid in sub-zero temperatures. They would die from insufficient calories. The risk calculation was clear. By February 20th, 11 days into the collection system, Kozlowski had hidden enough recovered food to extend rations by 6 additional days. Official rations were scheduled to run out on February 27th, but Kozlowski's cache system would feed the battalion through March 4th, buying 7 extra days for the supply convoy to arrive. That was not enough. The convoy was not expected until mid-March at earliest. Kozlowski needed to extend rations by at least 2 more weeks. He started implementing more aggressive recovery procedures. Soup bones from canned meat were normally discarded. Kozlowski began collecting them, boiling them repeatedly to extract marrow and remaining nutrients. The resulting broth was thin but caloric. He buried 60 gallons of bone broth in Cache Site 7. Bacon grease from rare bacon rations was liquid gold. Kozlowski saved every drop, storing it separately for use in frying or as flavoring for otherwise bland dishes. 8 pounds of bacon grease went into Cache Site 9. Egg powder residue from mixing containers was scraped out and saved. 5 pounds of dried egg powder residue, normally rinsed away, went into Cache Site 10. Even the wax coating on cheese rations was collected. Wax could be melted and mixed with rendered fat to create candles or fire starters, reducing fuel consumption and freeing up fuel rations for other uses. This was not food, but it extended non-food resources, which indirectly protected food supplies. Kozlowski was extracting value from materials the Army did not even classify as waste. He was creating something from nothing through systematic attention to what everyone else ignored. By February 25th, 2 days before official rations ran out, Kozlowski had accumulated enough recovered food to extend supplies by 18 additional days. Combined with official rations, the battalion could now survive until March 16th. If the convoy arrived on schedule around March 15th, the battalion would make it. But Kozlowski knew convoys rarely arrived on schedule in the Aleutians. He kept collecting. Every meal produced more recovered calories. Every day created more margin for survival. On February 26th, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes ordered final inventory of all remaining food supplies. The supply officer reported that official rations would be exhausted by evening of February 27th. Hayes ordered implementation of starvation rations starting February 28th. 1 meal daily, minimum portions, priority to soldiers maintaining defensive positions. Kozlowski said nothing during this meeting. He knew the starvation rations would not be necessary, but he could not reveal the cash system yet. He needed officers to believe the situation was desperate. He needed them to see soldiers weakening. Then he could prove his system worked by showing soldiers remaining strong while eating from hidden supplies. On February 27th, the last official rations were served. Dinner that evening was thin soup with hardtack. Soldiers complained, but ate everything. Many assumed this was their last full meal for weeks. That night, after the mess tent closed, Kozlowski retrieved containers from Cache Site 1. He carried them into the kitchen, opened them, and began preparing the next day's meals using recovered fat and saved ingredients. The Army thought the battalion was out of food, but Kozlowski was just getting started. February 28, 1943, 0500 hours. The temperature outside the mess tent was minus 18 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind speed 25 miles per hour. Wind chill approximately minus 50. Kozlowski stood in the kitchen preparing breakfast from supplies that officially did not exist. He had retrieved 6 gallons of rendered fat from Cache Site 1, 5 gallons of bean water from Cache Site 2, and 20 pounds of hardtack crumbs from Cache Site 4. He heated the rendered fat in large skillets over kerosene burners, adding hardtack crumbs to create a crude fried bread similar to fritters. He mixed bean water with remaining vegetable liquid to create a thin soup. He brewed coffee using third-use grounds that still contained some caffeine. The meal looked unappetizing. Gray fried bread, brownish soup, weak coffee. But it contained approximately 800 calories per soldier, enough to prevent immediate starvation. At 0600 hours, Kozlowski opened the mess tent and began serving. Soldiers entered expecting minimal rations or possibly no breakfast at all. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes had announced the previous evening that starvation rationing would begin today. Most soldiers assumed breakfast would be postponed or limited to coffee only. Instead, they received fried bread, soup, and coffee. Small portions, but real food. Private First Class Tommy Morrison from Oklahoma was first in line. He looked at his tray, looked at Kozlowski, and asked the obvious question. "I thought we were out of food." Kozlowski kept his expression neutral. "Eat your breakfast, Private." Morrison ate. Other soldiers followed. Nobody complained about the taste because nobody expected anything. The fried bread was greasy but filling. The soup was bland but warm. The coffee was weak but caffeinated. Soldiers ate everything and left the tent confused but fed. Lieutenant Hayes entered the mess tent at 0645 after most soldiers had finished. He looked at the serving line, looked at Kozlowski, and walked directly to the kitchen area. "Corporal," Hayes said quietly, "I was under the impression we exhausted food supplies yesterday." Kozlowski met his eyes. "We exhausted official rations, sir. I have been maintaining auxiliary supplies." Hayes frowned. Auxiliary supplies were not listed in inventory reports. "No, sir, they were not." "Explain." Kozlowski had prepared for this conversation. He spoke clearly and without hesitation. "Sir, I have been recovering edible material that would normally be discarded under standard field procedures. Rendered fats, cooking liquids, reusable ingredients. I have been storing these materials in cold storage and using them to supplement rations. The system has been operational since February 10th. Hayes was silent for 10 seconds. Then he said, "Show me." Kozlowski led Hayes outside. They walked to cache site 1, 50 yards from the mess tent. Kozlowski counted paces from the supply bunker corner, found the marked location, and began digging through snow. 3 feet down, he uncovered canvas covering. Beneath the canvas were wooden crates. Inside the crates were mason jars and metal containers filled with rendered fat, solidified and frozen. Hayes stared at the cache. "How much food have you stored this way?" 11 cache sites, sir. Estimated total caloric content approximately 3 million calories. Enough to maintain current troop strength for approximately 3 additional weeks at survival rations. Hayes looked at Kozlowski. "You did this without authorization." "Yes, sir. I believed authorization would be denied if requested. You violated field manual sanitation protocols." "Yes, sir. Specifically, Section 4, Food Handling and Preparation Standards." "You understand, this is court-martial offense." "Yes, sir. I accept full responsibility." Hayes was quiet again. Then he asked a different question. "Have any soldiers reported illness from consuming this recovered food?" "No, sir. No reports of food poisoning or digestive illness since February 10th. I have been monitoring sick call reports daily." Hayes looked back at the cache, at the containers of frozen fat, at the proof of Kozlowski's illegal operation. Then he made his decision. "You will brief company commanders on cache locations and inventory. You will continue current food preparation protocols. You will maintain detailed records of all recovered materials and their sources. And you will report directly to me every 48 hours on remaining supplies and projected duration." Kozlowski kept his expression carefully neutral. "Understood, sir. Am I being charged with violations?" "Not currently," Hayes said. "If soldiers start dying from food poisoning, you will face court-martial and possible execution for negligent homicide. If soldiers survive because of this system, I will recommend you for commendation after we are relieved. Do you understand the stakes?" "Yes, sir." "Then get back to work." Hayes walked back toward command headquarters. Kozlowski stood by the cache for a moment, then returned to the kitchen. Sullivan was waiting, looking nervous. "What happened?" Sullivan asked. "Hayes knows. He authorized continuation." Sullivan's expression shifted from fear to relief. "So we're not in trouble?" "We are in trouble if anyone gets sick. But we are authorized to keep cooking." Over the next 6 days, Kozlowski's system kept the battalion fed. Soldiers received 1 meal daily, prepared from recovered ingredients. The meals were unappetizing, but sufficient. Nobody gained weight, but nobody collapsed from starvation either. Soldiers maintained defensive positions, continued patrols, performed essential duties. Medical officers reported 0 cases of food poisoning. By March 6th, official rations had been exhausted for 7 days. Kozlowski had depleted cache sites 1 through 5. He was working from cache sites 6 through 11. He calculated remaining supplies would last until March 16th, possibly March 18th, if he implemented additional conservation measures. The supply convoy was now expected to arrive March 14th, weather permitting. The battalion was going to survive. But on March 7th, the situation changed dramatically. Japanese forces launched a surprise attack on Attu Island. Intelligence had failed to detect enemy transport ships approaching through fog. At 0430 hours, approximately 300 Japanese soldiers landed on the southwestern beach and began advancing toward American positions. The 184th Infantry Regiment was now in combat while subsisting on starvation rations. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes called emergency assembly at 0500. All available soldiers mobilized to defensive positions. The Japanese advance was repelled after 7 hours of fighting. American forces held all positions. But the engagement revealed a critical problem. Soldiers were too weak to fight effectively. Sergeant William Chen, the supply sergeant who had been recovering from malnutrition, had returned to duty on March 1st. He had been assigned to a machine gun position overlooking the beach. When Japanese forces attacked, Chen engaged immediately. But after 30 minutes of sustained firing, Chen collapsed from exhaustion. Medics pulled him from the line. He had simply lacked the physical stamina to operate his weapon continuously. Private Eddie Johnson from Tennessee passed out while carrying ammunition to forward positions. He had been running uphill, carrying 60 pounds of ammunition belts. His body failed halfway up the slope. The ammunition reached the position 20 minutes late. Corporal Marcus Washington from Georgia suffered cold injuries to his hands during the engagement. He had been firing his rifle for 2 hours in minus 20-degree temperatures. His hands lost sensation and became clumsy. He dropped his rifle twice. Medics later determined he had mild frostbite because his body lacked sufficient energy to maintain circulation to his extremities while simultaneously fighting. The battle was won. 12 American casualties, 3 killed, 9 wounded. Japanese forces withdrew, leaving approximately 50 dead on the beach. But Hayes understood immediately that the victory was marginal. If Japanese forces attacked again with larger numbers, the weakened American garrison might not hold. Hayes called Kozlowski to headquarters that evening. "Corporal, I need an assessment. Can you increase caloric output to restore combat effectiveness?" Kozlowski had been expecting this question. "Sir, current rations provide approximately 800 calories per soldier daily. To restore full combat capability, soldiers need at least 2,000 calories daily, preferably 3,000. I do not have sufficient recovered supplies to sustain that level." How long would increased rations last? At 2,000 calories per soldier, current supplies would last 6 days. At 3,000 calories, 3 days. After that, we revert to starvation rations, or we starve completely. Hayes considered this. The convoy is expected in 7 days. Can you sustain 2,000 calories until the convoy arrives? Only if the convoy arrives exactly on schedule, sir. Any delay and we run out completely. Hayes made his decision. Increase rations to 2,000 calories starting tomorrow. We need combat-capable soldiers if the Japanese attack again. If the convoy is delayed, we will face that problem when it occurs. Kozlowski nodded. Understood, sir. That night, Kozlowski retrieved supplies from all remaining cache sites. He calculated exact portions needed to provide 2,000 calories per soldier for 7 days. The mathematics were tight. He would need to use every container of rendered fat, every gallon of bean water, every pound of hardtack crumbs. Nothing could be wasted. No margin for error existed. On March 8th, Kozlowski served the largest meals soldiers had seen in 3 weeks. Fried bread made from recovered fat and hardtack crumbs. Thick soup made from bean water, vegetable liquid, and bone broth. Coffee brewed from second-use grounds. The portions were substantial. Soldiers ate until full for the first time since February. The response was immediate. Soldiers reported feeling stronger within hours. Energy levels improved. Cold tolerance increased. Men who had been lethargic became alert. Defensive positions were reinforced. Patrols resumed normal schedules. By March 10th, the battalion had regained approximate combat effectiveness. Medical officers reported that soldiers were still undernourished but capable of sustained operations. Hayes authorized offensive patrols to push Japanese reconnaissance away from American positions. But Kozlowski knew the timeline was critical. His supplies were depleting exactly as calculated. By March 13th, he would serve the last meal from recovered stores. After that, nothing remained. If the convoy did not arrive by March 14th, the battalion would be completely without food. March 13th arrived. Kozlowski served breakfast using the final containers from Cache Site 11. Lunch was the last of the rendered fat and hardtack crumbs. Dinner was bone broth and coffee from fourth-use grounds. After dinner, the kitchen was completely empty. No food remained in any cache. No official rations existed. Kozlowski had nothing left to serve. That night, he sat in the empty kitchen and waited. Either the convoy would arrive tomorrow, or 512 soldiers would start starving. At 0830 hours on March 14th, lookouts spotted ships on the horizon. The supply convoy had arrived exactly on schedule. 3 hours later, fresh rations were being unloaded on the beach. By evening, soldiers were eating regular meals from newly delivered supplies. The battalion had survived 37 days on rations meant to last 14 days. Nobody had starved. Combat effectiveness had been maintained even during active engagement with enemy forces, and the entire survival was attributable to one corporal's illegal decision to stop throwing away food. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes submitted his after-action report to Division Command on March 16th. The report described defensive operations, enemy casualties, and supply situation. It included a detailed section on Kozlowski's food recovery system. Hayes recommended the system be evaluated for implementation across all Arctic operations. Division Command responded on March 20th. Kozlowski was ordered to report to headquarters for debriefing. The court-martial he had feared never materialized. Instead, something entirely different happened. Captain Richard Stevens from Division Supply Command arrived on Attu Island on March 22, 1943. He brought 3 other officers, 2 nutritionists, and a photographer. Their orders were to investigate Kozlowski's food recovery system and determine whether it could be standardized across Aleutian garrisons. Stevens interviewed Kozlowski for 6 hours. He inspected all 11 cache sites. He reviewed records of recovered materials, preparation methods, and caloric calculations. He interviewed soldiers who had eaten from recovered supplies. He consulted with medical officers about health impacts. Then, he ordered Kozlowski to demonstrate the entire system from start to finish. On March 23rd, Kozlowski prepared a demonstration meal using supplies that had been hidden for over a month. He opened cans of Spam, collected rendered fat, created fried bread from fat and hardtack crumbs, made soup from bean water and vegetable liquid. He served the meal to Stevens and the evaluation team. Stevens ate everything on his tray. Then he asked technical questions. This rendered fat. It was stored frozen for 5 weeks? Yes, sir. Buried in snow at constant sub-zero temperatures. Any degradation in quality? None detected. Fat remains solid when frozen, liquefies normally when heated, shows no signs of spoilage. Bean water. How long does it remain safe? Frozen, indefinitely. At room temperature, approximately 72 hours before fermentation begins. I used all bean water. within 48 hours of collection. Hardtack crumbs. Nutritional value? Identical to intact hardtack. Crumbs are mechanically damaged biscuits, not degraded product. Flour content unchanged. Stevens made notes. Then he asked the critical question. In your assessment, Corporal, how much additional food supply does this system generate compared to standard procedures? Kozlowski had calculated this precisely. Sir, over 37 days, the system recovered approximately 3,200,000 calories from material that would normally be discarded. That represents additional food supply equivalent to approximately 21 days of survival rations for 500 soldiers. Effective extension of 14 days official rations to 37 days total. A multiplication factor of approximately 2.6. Yes, sir. Every day of official rations becomes 2.6 days of actual consumption through recovery procedures. Stevens was silent. Then he said something Kozlowski had not expected. Corporal, you understand that your system violates multiple field regulations. Yes, sir. You also understand that those regulations exist to prevent disease outbreaks that have killed thousands of soldiers in previous conflicts. Yes, sir. But Arctic conditions provide natural preservation that temperate climates do not. Frozen storage eliminates most spoilage risk. Risk calculation changes when temperature is permanently sub-zero. Stevens nodded slowly. That is exactly correct. And that is exactly why Division Command is interested in your methods. Standard regulations assume temperate climate operations. Arctic operations require different protocols. He closed his notebook. Corporal Kozlowski, Division Command is recommending your system for implementation across all Aleutian garrisons. We are also recommending modification of field manual protocols to explicitly authorize cold weather food recovery procedures. Your methods will be documented and distributed as official doctrine. Kozlowski kept his expression neutral. Understood, sir. One more thing. You are being promoted to sergeant. You will be reassigned to division headquarters to train other cooks on recovery protocols. Pack your gear. You leave tomorrow. Kozlowski had not expected promotion. He had expected, at best, to avoid court-martial. Sir, I would prefer to remain with my battalion. Request denied. We need you training personnel across the theater. This system could save thousands of soldiers. You are more valuable as instructor than as battalion cook. Kozlowski nodded. He understood orders. Over the next 3 months, Kozlowski trained 47 cooks from various units across the Aleutian Islands. He taught them cache site selection, rendered fat collection, bean water preservation, hardtack crumb recovery, coffee ground reuse. He emphasized sanitation and cold storage. He explained the mathematics of caloric extension. He demonstrated every procedure personally. By June 1943, 18 Aleutian garrisons had implemented variations of Kozlowski's system. Division supply officers reported effective food supply extension averaging 2.3 times baseline rations. Incidents of cold weather malnutrition dropped by 60%. No outbreaks of food poisoning were attributed to recovery procedures. In August, the Army revised Field Manual 21-10 to include an appendix on cold weather food preservation. The appendix explicitly authorized rendered fat collection, cooking liquid reuse, and secondary ingredient recovery when operating below freezing temperatures. The appendix credited innovations developed during Aleutian operations, but did not name Kozlowski specifically. Kozlowski received no medal. No ceremony recognized his contribution. He was promoted to staff sergeant in September based on time and grade and performance evaluations. His personnel file included a commendation letter from Lieutenant Colonel Hayes describing exceptional resourcefulness during critical supply shortage. The letter mentioned innovative cooking procedures, but provided no specific details. In November 1943, Kozlowski was transferred to Attu Island to train newly arrived kitchen staff. He spent the rest of the war teaching cooks how to stop wasting food. He returned to Chicago in October 1945, received honorable discharge, and went back to working in restaurant kitchens. Nobody in his family knew what he had done during the war. When asked, Kozlowski said he had been a cook in Alaska. He did not mention that he had kept 500 men alive through a winter that should have killed them. Did not mention that he had multiplied Army rations by redesigning waste protocols. Did not mention that his illegal methods had become official doctrine. The system itself spread beyond the Aleutians. In late 1943, cold weather recovery procedures were implemented in Iceland, northern Norway, and eventually during winter operations on the Eastern Front after the war. Thousands of soldiers survived supply shortages because cooks learned to recover calories from materials previously considered waste. But Kozlowski's name disappeared from the documentation. By 1945, the recovery procedures were simply listed as standard cold weather protocols. Origin was attributed to wartime experience without specifics. The institutional knowledge spread. The individual credit vanished. Kozlowski died in 1989 at age 74. His obituary in the Chicago Tribune mentioned his military service in one sentence. Sergeant Frank Kozlowski served in the United States Army during World War II in the Attu Islands. No mention of the 500 soldiers he saved. No mention of the system he invented. No mention that he changed how the Army fed troops in winter warfare. The United States Army Quartermaster Museum at Fort Gregg Adams, Virginia, has a permanent exhibit on World War II logistics. One small display case in the corner of the Cold Weather Operations section contains artifacts from Aleutian campaigns. A rusted Spam can, a hardtack biscuit preserved in resin, a mason jar that once held rendered fat, a wooden crate used for cash storage. The placard reads, Cold Weather Food Preservation. During operations in the Attu Islands, Army cooks developed innovative methods for extending food supplies under Arctic conditions. Recovery of rendered fats, reuse of cooking liquids, and frozen storage techniques increased effective ration supply by up to 3 times. These methods became standard doctrine for winter operations and saved countless lives during supply shortages. The placard does not mention Frank Kozlowski, does not mention February 1943, does not mention that one cook, working alone in a freezing tent, decided to break regulations because following regulations would kill his friends. That is how military innovation actually works. Not through official research programs or command decisions, through scared soldiers improvising solutions to immediate problems. Through people who see what everyone else ignores and refuse to accept that waste is inevitable. Kozlowski saw fat being thrown away while men starved. He stopped throwing it away. The solution was that simple. The implementation was that illegal. The impact was that profound. But history does not record the names of cooks. History records generals and battles and grand strategies. History remembers D-Day and Midway and Stalingrad. History forgets the staff sergeant from Chicago who multiplied rations by collecting grease. Except in one place. In Attu Island, Alaska, now abandoned and returned to wilderness, There are still 11 unmarked locations where snowdrifts once concealed cache sites. The caches are long gone, removed when the garrison closed in 1944. But if you knew where to look, if you counted 15 paces north and 8 paces west from where the supply bunker once stood, you would find the spot where Kozlowski buried his first container of rendered fat on February 9th, 1943. Nothing marks the location. No plaque, no memorial, just frozen ground where a cook once decided that Army regulations mattered less than keeping soldiers alive. That decision saved 512 men. That decision changed military doctrine. That decision proved that sometimes the most important innovations come from the people history forgets. Frank Kozlowski never received a medal for what he did. Never received public recognition. Never received anything except a promotion he had not wanted and orders to teach other people his methods. But on March 14, 1943, when the supply convoy finally arrived and soldiers realized they had survived an impossible shortage, several dozen men walked to the mess tent to find Kozlowski. They wanted to thank him. They wanted to shake his hand. They wanted to tell him that they understood what he had done. Kozlowski was in the kitchen, cleaning equipment, preparing for the evening meal using fresh supplies. When soldiers approached, he looked up, nodded, and went back to work. He did not want thanks. He had been doing his job. The job was feeding soldiers. He had fed them. That was enough. Later that evening, Private Danny Sullivan found Kozlowski sitting outside the tent smoking a cigarette, looking at the snow where cache sites were still buried. Sullivan sat down next to him. "You saved a lot of people," Sullivan said. Kozlowski shook his head. "I just stopped throwing away food." "That is not what you did. You figured out something nobody else saw. You broke rules nobody else would break. You kept us alive when we should have died." Kozlowski was quiet for a long time. Then he said something Sullivan remembered for the rest of his life. "My mother fed 6 kids through the Depression on almost nothing. She taught me you do not waste food when people are hungry. The Army was wasting food. Men were hungry. I stopped the waste. That is all." Sullivan tried to argue, tried to explain that Kozlowski had done something remarkable. But Kozlowski had already finished his cigarette. He stood up, walked back into the kitchen, and started preparing for the next day's work. That was Frank Kozlowski, a cook who saw a problem, fixed it, and refused to accept credit. A soldier who saved 500 lives by breaking rules written to save lives. A man who understood that regulations exist to serve people, not the other way around. The Army eventually understood this too. The field manual changed. The doctrine changed. Cold weather food recovery became standard practice. But by the time those changes were official, Kozlowski was already back in Chicago, working in a restaurant kitchen, feeding people the way he always had. No waste. Maximum efficiency. Everyone gets fed. That was the lesson from Attu Island. Not that one cook was brilliant. That waste is a choice. That survival often depends on someone recognizing what everyone else throws away. That the difference between starving and surviving can be as simple as collecting fat from the bottom of a Spam can and refusing to believe that good food belongs in the garbage. Frank Kozlowski proved that in February 1943. The proof is in the official doctrine that still guides military food service in cold weather operations. The proof is in the thousands of soldiers who survived supply shortages using techniques that started with one illegal decision in one freezing tent. The proof is in 500 men who lived through a winter that should have killed them all.